Hello and welcome to day 4 of the International Women in Travel and Tourism Digital Forum. My name is Jamie Lee Avatar and I am the program lead for the BAME Women in Travel program at Women in Travel CIC. And what a week it has been so far, with so many interesting and thought-provoking discussions to help push the dial forward on diversity and inclusivity in the travel industry. The key theme for today is how do we build an inclusive travel and tourism industry? The first session for today, which I will be hosting, is a taster of our popular Allyship Curate, which we run for senior leaders in organizations. I will be joined in just a few minutes by 3 expert esteemed panelists on allyship. So to set the scene, I'm going to just share with you guys a really short presentation about allyship. So why does diversity matter? I mean, this entire week we spent so much time talking about all different angles of diversity and inclusivity. And there are loads of white papers, articles, case studies that highlight that diversity is not just a responsible thing to do, but it also provides a huge competitive advantage. And in an industry like that we are in, where the customer ultimately reigns supreme, diversity and inclusion does give our organizations a massive competitive edge, connecting them more closely with customers, becoming a magnet for prized talent, and ultimately boosting their bottom line. There are 2 statistics that I always like to share with people, and it says from a recent McKinsey study, and it says companies with leadership in the top quartile for gender diversity were 15% more likely to have financial returns above their industry median. And companies with leadership in the top quartile for racial and ethnic diversity were 35% more likely to have financial returns above their industry median. Next slide, please. Allyship can, and I strongly believe that allyship can be a driving force for diversity and inclusion in the travel and tourism industry. Next slide. So what do we mean by allyship? I like to look at allyship as a process, a lifelong process of building relationships based on trust, consistency, and accountability with underrepresented or marginalized individuals and groups of people. And I personally believe that allyship gives us an opportunity to grow and to learn about ourselves whilst building confidence in others. With reference to the workplace, an ally is someone who intentionally and proactively acts to ensure that inclusivity is embraced so that everyone is impacted upon positively. And an ally can be identified for different categories of people and different reasons. For example, you can be an ally to people of color. You can be an ally to women, to the LGBTQ community, and so on. Normally, you are identified as an ally because in some ways you have privileges. A privilege is something you enjoy, and that does not depend on your skills or talent or hard work. It is something you are born with and you have not chosen. Think, for example, of the color of your skin, your gender, the family that you are born into, and so on. No one can accuse you of having a privilege, but somehow it is your responsibility to use it to benefit those who might be at a disadvantage. So you can be an ally because you recognize that you have privileges that other people don't have. For example, according to research, for every 100 men that are promoted to management between 2018 and 2019, only 72 women are promoted, only 58 women of color are promoted, and only 62 Latinx women are promoted. Therefore, for a woman trying to climb the career ladder in the workplace, a man can be seen as an ally because that man will have privileges for the very fact of being a man. Equally, a white woman might be an ally to a woman of color because women of color have additional disadvantages with respect to their white colleagues. By the way, that is called intersectionality, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in our discussion. The fact that your disadvantages are compounded, and that, for example, even as a woman in the workplace, your experiences may be different and worse than mine because of the fact that you are a woman and from a BAME background, are disabled, or both. Next slide, please. So why does allyship matter? Allyship matters because if we acknowledge that we have privileges, we need to ensure that we use these privileges to improve the lives of others. As an ally, we are called to speak up, to ensure that we do not turn a blind eye to injustices, to racism, to gender inequality in the workplace and within our wider industry. We must all play our part. And I strongly believe that as we begin to rebuild a bigger and better travel industry, we must all hold ourselves accountable. And I want to play a really short video for you guys. It's from Bex Shapiro, who was the former global social media manager of Intrepid Travel. And travel is for everyone. And we will dive a bit deeper into that video as we go on with our expert panelists. But change happens. I strongly believe that change happens when we take a bunch of intentional small steps. And I know that conversations around race, gender, and similar issues can be very challenging, uncomfortable, and sometimes painful. Often people will shy away in order not to make mistakes. But actually recognizing that we have made a mistake, but we want to learn and do better is a key characteristic of an ally. There are many ways to be an ally in practice, often starting with those small daily gestures of support. As mentioned, it all starts with recognizing that we can be an ally to someone who does not enjoy our privileges. Our panel will discuss and explore some of these topics in more detail as we go on. So we all have an opportunity to be an ally. Being an ally is important to really ensure our workplaces are inclusive and beneficial to all. First and foremost, we have to be willing enough, humble enough, and open enough to recognize that we have much to learn and improve that may at times feel uncomfortable. But that is how we move forward and progress. And I am really excited today to have these three exceptional individuals who have been talking about allyship for well over, I don't want to put the number of years. So we're going to invite our panelists to the stage now as they all pop up. Hello, guys. How are you? You're missing one more. Hello, Rachel. Hi, guys. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's great to be here.
I'm really looking forward to it. So I'm going to just give you a brief introduction of each of our panelists. So we have Yolanda Osagade, who is an award-winning content creator, influencer, and DEI marketing consultant. Yolanda has over 18 years of experience working in education, travel, and media sectors. Her roles have ranged from journalist, brand marketing consultant, creative lead, to workshop facilitator, working with brands like Google, Cathay Pacific, Etihad, Choose Chicago, Uncle Ben's, and others. Yolanda has been featured in a number of high-profile publications like Condé Nast Traveler, National Geographic, Essence, BBC Sound, and Forbes. She's a 2021 Black British Business Award nominee, and she has been recognized as one of the BAME 15 high flyers in the travel industry by WTM London. Thank you so much for joining us, Yolanda. Next up, we have Rachel Luft, and Rachel leads Expedia's group flagship inclusion learning program. called Ally Skills, maintaining a network of 90 plus trained trainers globally who support the scale and localization of the Ally Skills curriculum, which has been delivered to over 6,500 employees in 54 countries today. Rachel's responsibilities also include creating new learning programs and executing global campaigns with senior leadership endorsements to drive participation in inclusion learning. And last but certainly not least is Yuen Zhang, is experientialist in chief of Luxury and Experiential Travel Journal, rooted in diversity, discovery, and discernment, Out There magazine. He is the winner, the 2020 winner of the Editorial Leader of the Year at the Campaign Publishing Awards, and led the title to win Publication of the Year at the 2018 Travel Media Awards. Through Out There, Yuen also delivers bespoke content creation and creative branding, primarily working with destinations and luxury travel brands, specializing in both luxury and inclusive and diversity-driven content for the modern traveler. He's the founder of the global LGBT Travel Symposium series, helping and training travel brands to be more inclusive in their outreach, and co-founder of Stockholm LGBT, a members-based destination marketing platform. So thank you guys so much for joining us. You can see that we have some real experts in allyship and diversity and inclusion here with us today. And I want to kick off with you, Yolanda, just to underline what we saw in the introductory video with Bex from Intrepid. Could I ask you to kind of briefly summarize for us the definition of an ally, and is this a new concept?
The definition of allyship is definitely not new. I think both of you ladies really kind of hit the nail on the head when you talked about it. One, being a lifelong process and journey. It's not a destination that you're going to get to. You don't reach this lovely allyship destination at some point in time. It is something that you commit to. It is intentional. It is saying, you know what, I'm going to use my influence. I'm going to use my privilege. I'm going to use whatever place that I'm in to help bring others up. And whether it's not in this like I just want to lift people up. It's not this kind of savior complex. It's about saying, recognizing the privileges that you have and using them to speak up and to advocate for those that might be a little more marginalized than you are. And that is to say is that all of us can have different levels of privilege, and all of us can become better allies. So when it comes to allyship, it's intentional.
Yes, intentional. And I love the metaphor that you just used. It's a journey, not a destination. It really sums up the whole process of allyship. Yuen, I'm going to jump to you. Allyship is just one part of striving towards greater diversity and inclusion alongside all of the other things like recruitment, coaching, champion internally. But how important of a role do you think it plays, or can it play, in helping companies to have more inclusive attitudes without having allies across the business? It's like two really good questions. The first one is really about how important of a role do you think it can play? And then how can companies achieve more inclusive attitudes across the business?
Sure, absolutely. Firstly, Jamie Lee and Women in Travel, thank you for having me. This panel is amazing. It's such a diverse panel. And just to answer your question, allyship is crucial, absolutely crucial. I think the most crucial step actually to nurturing greater diversity, equity, and inclusion in organizations in all our industries. We from diverse and minorities communities can't do it alone. The operative word there is minority. It takes a village, so to speak. And those in the majority, if they can start to count us in the majority or speak up for, call out the inequalities, then we can start to move and in cases progress to DEI. Also, so much of diversity is reactive. We need to start becoming proactive. We must bring inclusive practices into our everyday. not just when something goes wrong or a crisis happens. That seems to be the case when DEI suddenly gets flared, something goes wrong. And that will not happen unless there is a change in our business culture and individual personalities as well. And that's what allyship is. So allyship is just not about a person. It's also about a culture. We must move away from only becoming engaged in conversation because something bad has happened. Allyship is also proactive, is action-oriented. It means making a conscious decision to do something to make waves, however small or large. So much about diversity, and after a whole year since the murder of George Floyd, it has been a year when this first flared up, I still see so much. So many people are talking about diversity. Don't get me wrong, talking about diversity is a good thing. Any discussion about diversity is a good thing. But it's now time for us to take some of that chin wagging and make some proactive and progressive steps towards achieving more inclusive industries. Allyship is that step, because the minute you fathom and rationalize what being an ally is, you'll start to see the world differently and understand how important it is for you to make a difference. As to your second question, can companies achieve inclusive attitudes without having allies across the business? Short answer, no. First, all companies need champions. Yeah, champions are important. So those people from minority backgrounds or people from diverse backgrounds need to champion themselves or be championed. And the only way they can be championed is through an ally. I know for our work in LGBTQ, that the advances that we've made as a community would not have been possible without people having stood up and becoming allies to the community, to call things out when things are wrong and to make things better so bad things never ever happen again.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. And I love the point about, being proactive versus reactive. You're 100% on the mark when you talk about, so many companies thinking that in the wake of the death of George Floyd, deciding that, okay, now I need to put DEI policies or processes in place, but not actually, thinking it through in terms of the strategic angle, but just wanted to kind of almost diversity wash it in some ways. And we have all that kind of performative allyship also coming out because people are, reacting to the situation versus embedding it into their culture. That makes any sense at all. But Yolanda, I'm going to come to you. I'm going to come to you shortly, Rachel, but I'm going to jump to Yolanda, and feel free to jump in here as well. I imagine that there might be people tuning in who would hope they think and act conscientiously and stand up for others. But what sort of questions should one ask themselves to see, am I really acting as an ally in the workplace? What kind of situations or opportunities might there be in the workplace where I can or need to demonstrate allyship?
Well, that is a very wide question.
Yeah.
Because one, you're looking at from the brand perspective, like you can't change what you can't measure. So if you're not measuring your impact when it comes to DEI in the organization, and then with your wider stakeholders, and then with your community and the people that you're trying to reach, there's no way that you can start to enact that change effectively and sustainably. But then from the personal side is, am I using my voice? Am I speaking up? Am I challenging my own internal biases? What are those biases? And a lot of it just comes down to being real with ourselves and saying, you know what, I've not been vocal. I've not used my voice. I've not challenged those biases. And that's at the very, what I would say, the baby level, the newborn level. And you have to keep pushing it, because if it's not uncomfortable, you're not pushing for change. Allyship is not a comfortable chair to sit in. And I'll give you an example. Like right now, I've just moved and I'm sitting on plastic chairs with a pillow underneath me. It is uncomfortable. Allyship is not this comfortable plush chair that we see and we would love to have. It's not like that. It's going to be uncomfortable. Sometimes it can get a little messy because it means being challenged and challenging yourselves and then allowing others to challenge you. So, a lot of it has to be a bit of a reckoning. You have to be willing to admit, you know what? I don't know everything. I have to sit down and I need to listen. And then I need to put that listening into action, which means sustainable change.
Thank you very much. That's fantastic. Sustainable change. And Rachel, Expedia has been working on allyship for quite a number of years, and you guys have a team dedicated to this. So can you tell us what part allyship plays in Expedia's inclusion and diversity strategy and activities? And has it also always been an integral part? And what form does your focus on allyship take?
Yeah. Well, again, thank you so much for inviting me to be on this panel. I'm super excited to be here. I think when it comes to Expedia Group, we have really been on this journey for quite a while. However, it was only in the last 2-3 years where we formed as an I&D team. So we're still very early on in our journey. And I like to set the kind of scene that we still have a lot of work to do. And I think that's so important to recognize, especially when we're looking at, some of the larger companies and you see what we're doing. I think, to some of the points already made, we need to go beyond the lip service and we need to really think about what is actually happening here. So when it came to Expedia Group and we were looking at our employee base, we thought, where are we going to start with this? Where is the fundamental and foundational place where we can start to begin our journey here at Expedia Group? And allyship is really, really important to that starting ground. It helps people to enter into that conversation who might not have ever entered that space before. So the way we're doing this at Expedia, as you mentioned, kind of with the introduction, is we have this 2-hour ally skills workshop where we kind of go through very basic terminology of like, what does diversity and inclusion even mean? What does privilege mean? And then we get people to reflect on their own. And then we move into like scenario discussions. So we're trying to make them really understand what it means to be an ally. Ally is a doing, it's an action, it's not a label. If people say I'm an ally, I want to know what that action is, and that's when they're an ally. So I think it's really important to kind of level set that as we're kind of entering into those discussions of what does it even mean to be an ally? It's a doing word, it's an action. And I really love that that's kind of been brought up. So at Expedia, we have this program. It started as a very grassroots thing. And it just built up over time. And I think that's when we realized the demand for this kind of workshop. People calling out saying, I don't know how to begin this journey. I don't know where to stand. I mean, for me, myself, I identify as a white woman. So, a lot of people entering into this journey, it can feel scary because you have the privilege in that situation. So to go, okay, I want to enter into this, but I don't know how to start. It's really important to give that space, that really safe space as an organization to really help people embark on that. So that's why it's been really integral really to our overall inclusion diversity strategy, because if your employees aren't invested and they're not on that journey with you, you're not going to get very far. You need allies. You need everyone on that journey, or collectively, or you're just not going to make the progress that you want to see. So that's kind of where we're at. We have, as you mentioned, we've now got around 40% of our employee population have been through that workshop, which is incredible, but we have a long way to go. But what we have seen is by making allyship a core component of our strategy, it has allowed us to make that progression, actually culture change, the way that our leaders speak, the way that we talk as a company. People now understand that every single one of those people in our organization is their responsibility. They need to take ownership. And that's really what's helped us move the dial.
Yeah, and it's very much driven from the leadership, isn't it? The allyship within the organization is very much driven by the leadership, you'll say?
Yeah. I couldn't really agree with that more. We found that, going from grassroots came from our CEO, Peter Kern, endorsing this workshop. And it literally overnight went from a grassroots thing of us, just offering it out to teams that people wanted it. We used to have, regular workshops, to it suddenly being this global learning program, which obviously was a very quick turnaround. But we got there, and we got there because everyone was rallying together collectively and knew how important that it was. And I cannot kind of underline enough how important it is to have your leaders there talking all the time about how inclusion is so important, because at the end of the day, leaders are responsible for their employees' sense of belonging. And I think it's important to recognize that, and it's important for them to kind of step up and speak to that. So I think there'll probably be quite a lot of people who are thinking, well, my leaders aren't invested. They're not hearing me right now. They're not stepping up right now. And I think, it will be very different in all the different organizations. It depends on your culture, who your leadership is. But we started with this grassroots program, and we just showed that the demand for it was just needed. People were asking for it. People were just like, we need more of this. And that actually helped to get their buy-in. So that might be a good place to start if people are looking for support from their leaders.
We're finding the same thing, because we also run a Allyship Curate, and we're finding the same thing across organizations, with they coming back and saying, we need the individual to attend. We need it to be longer. We need more sessions of this Allyship Curate. And I had a call recently from a lady who had attended one of the curates, and she called to say, you know, I was in a board meeting. There was another lady. She was like almost scared to speak up and say what her point. Like, she made her point, and then she kind of got shut down, and she was almost afraid. And she was the one who kind of stood up and like cleared the way for her to then have a say. She was like, I felt so proud. And she actually called me to tell me that, you know, like, I wouldn't have done that before, you know, but I wanted to be an ally and support her. And so, you know, it really is really important in organizations. So Ewan, what do you think are some of the barriers of people really understanding and embracing the potential of being an ally, and what puts people off, you think, being more proactive in this field?
Oh my God, where do I start? Okay, listen, I often say this and people laugh, but when it comes to the behavior of individuals within organizations, I don't think we've actually advanced much further than the school playground. You know, like at school, there are bullies. There are those that get bullied. There are those who stand up to bullies. There are those who are scared and that they will be picked on themselves. There are those who know they need to do something about it, but don't know what or how. And there are those who just want to go tell the teacher. You know, there are those who want to remain neutral and not get involved. And there are those who don't care. You know, this dynamic still exists in every workplace, except we have the brain and reasoning of an adult, or some of us do, but we have to be able to discern what's right and what's wrong. Allyship is not about creating a level playing field. I love that example that you just gave about paving the way through for someone else to speak. Allyship is not about creating a level playing field. Diversity and inclusion is about being able to lift those who are disadvantaged up and champion them and make sure they get ahead, because they lack the opportunities. So it's not, as an ally, you're not just bringing someone up to your level. You're pushing them onwards to be, you know, to be better than you almost. And that takes some gumption, you know. So I think that is the biggest barrier, actually. People also recognizing that there is a problem. And over the last year, I've encountered a great number of people that have only become aware in 2020 and 2021, you know, that racism, homophobia, transphobia, ageism actually exists. It's you know, where have you been? What rock have you been under? I mean, it's quite shocking. Then there's still those, and sadly, I think actually a growing number of people now that feel that discrimination is a made up thing, that there is actually a level playing field when it comes to equality, because we have the equality in the law, we have the equality in our policies, and it's then up to us as individuals to make the most of it. But like the school playground, there may be equality, but there isn't diversity and there isn't inclusion. And, you know, I say this, I don't think it's always consciously. So I think people need to overcome that barrier. You know, people need to think more consciously about it, to become allies and to rationalize that there are actually people out there that are disadvantaged, because they just don't take the world or the industry and workplace in the same way as others. You asked me what stops them from being proactive. Well, I think inclusion is actually quite an easy thing. Well, let's not say easy, but it's certainly not difficult. You know, people think it is. As an organization, we as a magazine, we come from an inclusive background, so we understand it, right? So people always say to me, well, that's easy for you. It's not easy for you, but it's not difficult. And then there are people, I also think, who are selfish, again, consciously or unconsciously. They don't see diversity and inclusion benefiting themselves, so they stop short. So, you know, and then there are those who want to make the change, but are too scared to say anything or do the wrong thing. So I think it's just really important that we just step out of our comfort zone. Like Yolanda said, it's going to be, you know, it's going to be an uncomfortable discussion. However, it's not going to be a difficult discussion. Don't think of it as a hill to climb. You know, think of it as being at the top of the hill and you're raising everyone up to the top of the hill.
That's a brilliant analogy. Anybody else has anything to share as it relates to, you know, the barriers that people may have in understanding and embracing the potential of allyship?
Yeah, I would love to say something. Just to share a story is I was sitting in on a session similar to this, where it's a panel session and then break out into small rooms with executive leaders. And there was a woman who brought up the fact that basically questioning allyship. And she's an executive leader. And she says, so just to get this right, allyship is about bringing other people up. And she's like, but I can't really do that as a white woman for Black people or people of color, because that's not my experience. It's about gender too, right? So I can work with other white women and that are maybe insecure or whatever. And, that was like a woo moment for, I mean, it was a visceral, I had like almost a really harsh emotion there. And, I had to calmly, hopefully correct her and say that's not that at all. And for anyone that might be tuning in, I believe that everyone tuning in is probably far, far beyond where she was when it comes to her allyship journey. But if you had any recollection that you thinking that it had to do with you having to personally relate to a marginalized community's experience, personalized experience, it is not that. That is not allyship. You do not have to personally have that lived experience to help others. So, that's something I really wanted to point out, that guys, it's far beyond that. It's not about having a personal lived experience that parallels another community's.
It's about your privileges and how you can use them to advance advance others, really. So do you guys have, this is that anybody can jump in here, any other practical steps that individuals can take in order to be a better ally? And also, how important do you think consistency is here?
So I don't mind starting this off, and it kind of is going back to the previous question a little bit. And I think some of the barriers into allyship, a lot of it comes from fear of making a mistake. A lot of people go, if I step forward and I say something and I say the wrong thing, then I'm going to make it so much worse. And I think, we've all spoken around how difficult this can be. Entering into conversations can be really difficult if you've never really experienced it yourself. You don't understand it. But that's why self-education is firstly very important. But I think just to share how we kind of try and tackle that at Expedia is we have this framework. And it's firstly, everyone is going to make mistakes. That is going to happen. And you need to understand that will happen at some point. But we just basically say, name it, claim it, and move on. And it's just so important that you do that. So if you make a mistake, just own it. Don't, keep apologizing and go, oh, I'm so sorry. Just be like, I am so sorry. I got this wrong. You name it and then you just move on. But just make sure you've learned from that mistake. And believe me, when those mistakes happen, you definitely learn if you're a true ally, because you'll do everything after that moment to make sure you never do that again. And, and that's from personal experience of, saying something that in hindsight, you think, oh, I shouldn't have said that. Or they say, oh, that was quite offensive. Or I would, and I think it's only through doing that you're going to learn. So that's just another barrier, I think, which is really important to acknowledge. If when you're entering this space, it's absolutely okay to feel uncomfortable, feel like you might make mistakes, because they're bound to happen. But yeah, just own it and move on.
Anyone else have anything to share around any practical steps that individuals can take to help being a better ally?
Yeah, I think absolutely. Listen. I think listen, and then listen again, and listen again and again. I've always, I've also encountered some allies, sometimes myself included. I'm like, we're all on the learning curve. That they think they understand everything there is to know about DEI. Allyship is a journey, like Yolanda says. It doesn't mean you achieve and get a certificate, and all of a sudden you get a badge on yourself, and you say, I'm an ally. It doesn't work like that. And I will never know what it's like to walk in the shoes. Or maybe figuratively, because I actually have literally walked in women's shoes. But I wouldn't know what it's like to walk in the shoes of women. But only listening, or someone who is less able, or someone who is older, or younger even, or less socially mobile. Only through listening will I understand what that is. It's not always black or white, for want of a better phrase. I don't mean this in regard to race. I mean, there's a lot of challenges that people face that aren't always immediately evident. Just because you see someone the way they are, your unconscious bias makes you form an opinion about them, but it doesn't mean that is the way, you know, that's always the way. So go deeper and listen. Allies have got to understand that it's not a one-size-fits-all answer. Diversity inclusion is not something, you know, you just learn and, you know, you have to. It's about a conversation. You know, it's not about, you can't get a degree for allyship. You know, you can't but you get there, you do get there by studying hard. And you do a medal eventually for doing something good because you're listening and you're making actually a commitment to humanity.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I love that. I love that. And Yolanda, in what ways could an ally unintentionally get it wrong? And what's some of the mistakes that they could probably avoid?
One, avoid being performative. We saw so much performative activism and performative allyship directly after the George Floyd tragedy. And that is just one example. I mean, this has been a trend that has been ongoing. It's like, oh, let me share a little bit about social media. Let me follow this community. Like, for instance, with everything going on with the AAPI community in the US and the surge of Asian hate that has happened in the US and it has spread. You know, these are things that have been going on for a long time, but it's now just coming, you know, and getting a lot more attention within the wider communities around the world. And it's just really interesting, let's say, for lack of better terms, to see how many people get it wrong. And that comes from this performative activism standpoint of saying, okay, you know, I'm going to share a post, I'm going to reshare a few memes, and, you know, I've done my job. I get my allyship cookie. And or I've joined clubhouse rooms where they might be talking about a specific death or murder that has happened. And then you have a person who wants to be an ally join the room and, you know, starts asking questions. And then even the people in the room, who typically are those from a marginalized community, then uplift that person just because they're showing interest in the subject. And so that's another way of like awarding performative allyship. And so that's a major, major issue. And I think we, as allies, you have to be very careful. You know, you have to look at your allyship very carefully. Don't overthink it to where it paralyzes you into inaction, right? But you need to look at it and ask questions, ask others, you know, and create relationships. Don't just go and think, oh, okay, I'm just going to try to get as much information as I can to help me. No, it's about, okay, how can I invest into others, get the right type of information? How do they want me to be a better ally? And I can say from personal experience, some of the best ways that I have experienced really great allyship that is not performative is by those friends of mine that have maybe slid into the DMs or left me a voice note and just asking me, are you okay? You know, what can I do better? You know, I was thinking about sharing this, but I thought better of it. You know, what do you think about this? And not putting too much maybe pressure or responsibility on someone who might be going through you know, inadvertent pressure, or who might be grieving because of a death in their community. I mean, there's a lot there, and there's a lot of nuance. And so I think just really focusing on the fact of it, like, is this performative or is it not? And then what type of support should I be giving, and what type of support should I be seeking as well to help me with my journey?
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Yolanda. And Rachel, I'm going to come to you. The debate around diversity and discrimination can be very politically charged and also highly sensitive. How does Expedia tackle trying to have, you know, these kind of conversations?
Do you know what? It's a really, really important question. And I'm really happy that you're kind of bringing it to the table, because I think there are so many nuances to it. I think it's a very complex question. And I think it's a lot of the time when we enter into these conversations, there is this gray area between human rights, social justice, and politics. And I think in this current climate, that has become very blurred, and there is a huge confusion, you know, when we talk about identity politics, that has now been brought together, which makes this whole conversation even harder. And that's been purposely done. You know, people kind of do that to try and confuse people and kind of throw them to like one side or the other and divide people. So really what we're trying to do at Expedia is we ground ourselves in our values, we ground ourselves in our inclusion and our diversity. And then we look, and you know, there may be times where politics does get brought into it, because that is really the current situation that we're in. And that's when we'll look and say, okay, where is our value? And we kind of move forward that way. I think it's just super important, and I'll keep underlying it. And everyone I speak to is always like, oh, you know, but you know, this side and this side, collectively, we will not move forward in the kind of world of inclusion and diversity and create equity for everyone if we are picking sides. I think to your point, Jamie Lee, earlier around intersectionality, we have to work collectively together. And we have seen where that has started to happen. We have seen where these, you know, identities and communities have come together. I mean, even at Expedia Group, we've got our employee resource groups. It's important that they are all working together, and collectively they're stronger. We're all stronger together. And I think the moment that you can realize that, you can really realize your power. And I also think back to that allyship point, you know, if there is, you know, a community who has just suffered, you know, a kind of a grief or something that's happening in that community, then another community steps in and helps. And I have seen so much of that in the last year, and it has been super powerful. So I think, you know, back to kind of your original question, you know, how do you deal with addressing all of that? Personally, I think it's important to address. I think we've seen the backlash that happened at base camp, you know, not that long ago, and Hal saying, we're not going to talk about this as an organization anymore. We're just here to work. People are very invested. It's society. People care about this. And I think as a company, you have to decide, where are your values? Where are you going to step forward? And only once you have got that in place, should you then start talking and addressing this. Because, you know, I think to Yolanda's point, you cannot go out and make these statements, these PR statements of like, we stand in solidarity, if you haven't got your own house in order or are trying very hard to figure that out, because that won't work and that will come back to you. So just super important to kind of really recognize those differences between what is human rights, what is social justice, and what is politics. And then once you can figure that out, just really ground yourself in your own values as a company, and, you know, kind of move forward from there.
Fantastic. And to your point about, you know, the only way that we are going to see any change is through collaboration and sharing and those networks. Earlier this week, UN and the Women in Travel, we hosted our first DEI Leaders Roundtable, which is across vertical, intersectional network of leaders from across the industry. And we saw the benefit there of sharing stories, sharing successes, sharing failures in, you know, for organizations to really go and embrace DEI. And, you know, Expedia has a very well-established program in place, but what about companies with no DEI strategy or program? How do they approach these conversations, and how do they, you know, for the first time, you think?
Do you know what? I think it's really important when we're talking about, you know, bringing in an inclusion diversity strategy for the first time, that we really recognize the work and the contributions that employees are currently doing voluntary, unpaid. That is something that I think is super important to get off of the ground. So I think, you know, if you're really starting, I couldn't emphasize enough that leadership support is what you need to really get this going. You know, you can have the grassroots initiatives, which are so important, and they are really the beginning of any movement. And I cannot echo and amplify enough like how important that voice is. But when those movements start, we need leaders to step in and to offer their voice and to offer their platform. And whether, you know, a lot of, I mean, as I mentioned with Expedia Group, with our Ally Skills program, that started grassroots with no budget. That was just people coming together and creating a workshop. And that's open source. So if anyone is interested, then feel free to reach out. That's there for you to take, you know, and there are so many resources out there, best practices out there to really help you start. And then I think once you start to get that kind of momentum, it's leadership that you really need to get to buy into that.
Thank you. Fantastic. We've got a few questions from the audience. I'm going to try to pull them up because I'm watching the time as well. We have one here from Chantel. She says, besides the business culture to change internally, what external actions are you taking right now to promote diversity and inclusion? I'm wondering if that's for you, Rachel, or she means generally. Yes, I think it sounds like it's going to be for you. So besides the business culture to change internally, what external actions can brands take? So anyone can jump in, really.
Yeah, I don't mind kicking it off, and I'd love to hear other people's thoughts. So at Expedia, we actually break down our kind of inclusion and diversity strategy into kind of four communities. So we obviously have internals, as in us, employees. We then have our customers. We have our partners, as in kind of the hotels and stuff we work with. And then we also have our communities. So we really look at the different areas in which we can have impact. And I would say, first and foremost, for us, we are very much focused on internally. We believe we need to get ourselves into a good place before we can then start going out into the world. But things that you can do, I mean, there's so much you can do. Firstly, sharing best practices, meeting people and kind of understanding and learning from others. There's some incredible resources out there. There are also things that, for example, Expedia Group, we've signed up to like the CEO Action Pledge, which is a commitment and an alliance of a lot of travel companies to say we commit to doing this. So there are many things you can do, but that's just a good starter. Is like look out there at other declarations, commitments that you can sign up for. Look at how you can share your own best practices and look how you can learn from others. Is a good thing to do. And then I think when you have that voice and you have that platform, what can you do with that platform? So, we've got brands within Expedia Group such as Orbitz, which is now an LGBTQIA+ focused traveling brand. And that is very much doing a lot of market research into how can we best serve our customers. And that's the kind of way that we're now looking at how we can support inclusion, diversity externally, looking at customers and things like that.
Oh, fantastic. Yolanda, before we go back to the audience questions, I want to, in wrapping up this kind of panel, do you think that the travel industry is making significant progress on improving diversity and inclusivity? We know that companies like, let's say, Intrepid Travel, Belmont, Expedia are clearly doing a lot, but we know there's many more companies doing nothing. So still seems like change is relatively slow. So what can we do to make change faster, both in terms of our teams and our companies? And that's, once Yolanda gives her answer, anybody else, feel free to jump in there as well.
One thing I don't want to see from brands is launching diversity talks and events without addressing their inward, without starting the process from within. So staffing, leveraging focus groups, online polls, community representatives, stakeholders, like these, all of these representatives can provide a lot more insight. So brands need to really get it right from there before they start launching all this amazing content and start working with creators that are from other marginalized communities. They have to question their optics, and they have to then go beyond them, meaning like, who's helping to tell the story of your brand, and how is that being distributed? And what is your distribution policy? What does that look like? And is it really reaching across different touch points? And so if you're working to build trust and avoiding performative activism, then you need to have a long-term plan when it comes to who's telling your story and how that looks. And that all then relates back to the internal structure. So the internal, if staff and stakeholders, if there's no diversity there, all of that trickles, it has a trickle down effect onto everything else, from your marketing to your communications to all of your PR. So you do have to do your research across a variety of touch points. And then when it comes to outreach, is just really nailing it, getting it right, making sure that you're being really open and honest and transparent when it comes to outreach. So if you're focusing on having your brand tell new stories, and you're like, okay, we've got this, we're really working on this internal thing, but then be really open and transparent whenever you're reaching out to others to really express your brand story, and then communicate how you want that to be communicated in a new and engaging way.
In an engaging way. And Yurin, do you think that there's a danger that companies think that there's a one-size-fits-all solution to diversity without realizing the intersectional nature of DEI?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the problem we're finding.
You're still here.
Yeah, I think that there's that people do think there's a one size, but like I said beforehand, there's this movement to think you can get a degree in diversity. That doesn't work. There's no such thing. It's a continuous learning process, and it's continually evolving. And I can tell you that from my perspective as well, from the LGBTQ community. I'm proud to be an Orbit's ambassador, by the way, Rachel, just so you know. But from the LGBTQ community, let's talk about the trans community. Okay, that's a community that's moving rapidly away from the LGBT community discussion within diversity into one that's about gender. So we've always been lumped as a group about sexuality, but actually the trans discussion is nothing to do with sexuality, it's to do with gender. So it's not new, but it's a new theory, it's a new practice. People talking about it as it's a new thing. Same with race. People are realizing that actually I'm not Asian, because Asian is such a catch-all for an entire continent. So if you want to drill down to different and understand the challenges of different communities, you can't group everyone together. I know you and I, Jamie, had a discussion about BAME or BIPOC. Can you even call people that? And I know that there's discussion now about people calling people about diverse communities. It's like, what does that even mean? That means white and big problem. That's a really big problem, because you're not valuing people for individuality. You're trying to pigeonhole people in a group and solve that problem. So to answer your question, no one size fits all. I also wanted to add about how we can get there, quicker. We have to work together. And Jamie, from our panel, our DEI leaders panel, that's definitely collaboration is so important. This is for the greater good. There's no competition. We're okay when we're travel companies, right? And we all compete with each other when it comes to business. We compete with other magazines, but there is no competition when it comes to diversity and inclusion. Like sustainability, there's no competition when it comes to sustainability. We're all going for the greater good of humanity. So we need to work together.
Rachel, to wrap up, there's one question from the panel. I'm going to try to get this one in. She says, Sarah's her name. How does Expedia promote inclusivity when it comes to lesser privileged tour operators, service providers from developing regions? Is there a social impact side of your work?
I love this question, and it goes back to where I was speaking around the 4 pillars that we have for our inclusion diversity strategy, and the different kind of stakeholders that we're looking into. So we have a team in Expedia Group. They are our community impact team, and they have recently been partnering with UNESCO to look at exactly this, to kind of see what impact are we having as a travel company and what more can we be doing, and I think how can we do that more sustainably. So we actually just released our impact report. It's our first ever impact report by Expedia Cares team. So if you want to hear kind of more on that, I would definitely check that out. But we're very early in the journey as well here. I think it's one of those things. It's easy to come out and be like, yeah, we're partnering here and we're doing this. There is a lot of work to be done, and we're working hard to get there, but we're by no means perfect.
Yeah. There's another question for you as well, Rachel. Is all around. We only have like 2 minutes left, but she wants to know more about your how the trainer workforce. Tell us a bit more about your workforce. I think she's talking about the trainer, and diversity and equality. But we have like 2 minutes, so just really short. You can just tell us what that is.
I'll make it very brief, and to anyone that wants to know this, feel free to just connect with me offline. But basically, it is an opportunity that we have at Expedia to train any employee to become an ally skills facilitator. They are given an option of a 10% allocation of their role to facilitate ally skills, and that is how we've managed to get this 90 people strong facilitator community is through that, and that was supported by our CEO saying, you know, this is a huge commitment, we want to support this. If anyone wants to use part of their job to push I&D within the organization, we want to respect that, we want to recognize it, we want to reward it. So that's a very quick, brief way of saying it, because I'm very conscious, but to that person, feel free to reach out to me, because I'd love to explain how we've done that.
And you can find all of our fantastic panelists on LinkedIn as well. You just search their names and you can find them on LinkedIn. But I just want to thank you guys so much for coming and chatting to us about allyship today. You gave some real practical solutions and examples of how allyship can really be used as a driving force for diversity and inclusivity in the travel and tourism industry. I hope that all of our listeners today gained some kind of key takeaway from this session, and that we all work harder to be better allies in everything that we do. Thank you guys so much. Small steps, big impact, and big action. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.